So good afternoon, all. Really sorry for the delay. We're like 15 minutes. We've taken up 15 minutes of your time, but I think we can start now. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our session, which is Mainstreaming Business and Human Rights in ASEAN, Whereabouts and Opportunities Ahead. So my name is Uma, and I am the Collective Operating Officer at CALR, which is short for Collective of Applied Law and Legal Realism, based in Kuala Lumpur. And we're actually quite new, but our work focuses on business and human rights on a broader perspective, and also human rights policy at the ASEAN level through the Working Group for an ASEAN Human Rights Mechanism. So with me here today, we have a complete panel of speakers already. We have a very, very strong panel of speakers with us here in person and also online. So on my left side, I have Dio Herdiawan Tobing, Head of Public Policy Asia at World Benchmarking Alliance. And then next to him is Ms. Lukita Setiarso, Partnership Officer specialized in child rights and business at UNICEF Indonesia. And on the very far left, I have Her Excellency Professor Dr. Amara Pongsapit, representative of Thailand to the AICHR. So we will be joined by Her Excellency Yuyun Wayun Ningrum, Chair of AICHR for the year 2023, and also the representative of Indonesia to the AICHR, who will be delivering her closing remarks at the end of the session. And we also have another speaker, Her Excellency Professor AICHR Bidin, who is the representative of Malaysia to the AICHR, who has joined us online. So essentially, the idea for today's side session is to share with the public the works of the AICHR, particularly in the area of business and human rights, and to learn some of the progress of corporate actors in the region when it comes to business and human rights, and also provide a platform for discussion on BHR in Southeast Asia region as a whole. So over the past week, AICHR Malaysia and AICHR Thailand had hosted programs focusing on BHR, where on the 29th and 30th of May, AICHR Malaysia has hosted a regional consultation on business and human rights, environment and climate change, while AICHR Thailand on the 1st of June had organized an AICHR regional dialogue on sharing good practices on business and human rights in ASEAN, which is actually a continuous activity that's been done by AICHR Thailand over the past few years. So just to kick off the discussion, I would like to invite Her Excellency Professor Aisha, who is joining us online, to share some of the key takeaways and recommendations from this consultation that was hosted by AICHR Malaysia, focusing on business and human rights, environment, and climate change.
Hello.
Yes, Prof, we can hear you.
Yeah, I tried to switch on the video, but they don't allow it. And it says that the host has stopped it.
Yeah. Can you try again?
Oh, okay, then that's better now. Okay, then. Okay, thank you, Uma. And of course, Excellencies, Professor Dr. Amara and other distinguished speakers as well, and of course, Mr. Dio. Yeah, right now the key takeaways from the recent event organized by AICHR Malaysia, which is on the 29th and 30th of May. One thing for sure is that the main objective is to raise awareness on the implementation of UNGP. And the crucial thing, of course, is to address the negative impacts related to business from environment and climate change, because the focus is on climate change is because it's a major concern to ASEAN, as Southeast Asia is one of the most at-risk regions in the world to the impacts on climate change. So what are the key takeaways of the event? I can summarize it to three key takeaways. One is that regarding the environment and climate change in the business human rights agenda in ASEAN, it seems that the event also has unveiled the fact that ASEAN member states have proactively taken measures to address the issues on the national, regional, and global level relating to environment and climate change. And this has been observed to the various reports, the ASEAN Member State National Reports, the ASEAN Community Vision 2025, and also the active participation of the UNFCCC in the Paris Agreement. And it is also agreeable and agreed by the participant that the impact of climate change on human rights include the impact of enjoyment of human rights, including right to life, health, housing, water, food, and development of future generations. But at the same time, we also observe that ASEAN lacked a systematic process and protocol as well that have, to a certain extent, slowed the pace of progress towards coming up with solutions. So in other words, some of the capacity, resources, environment, and especially enforcement issues are not leveraged to a certain level to ensure effective of environmental laws and regulations. The second takeaway is relating to the approach of addressing issues on environment and climate change, because it does not only require governments to have strict laws, enforcement, and increased capacity, but we also observe that quite a number of issues on environmental harm are actually across borders and cross sectors in ASEAN. And this would include issues and technical issues like extraterritorial and cross-border, and various sectors of the economy, and of course, various sectorial bodies. And this certainly is also another technical issues that I believe is very important, that requires collaboration of all the three pillars and ASEAN sectorial bodies. The third key takeaway is regarding the progression on the concept of due diligence in the region. It is considered to be still rather low. And also this especially reflected in the willingness of businesses among ASEAN member states to adopt new emerging standards such as due diligence, which is still very much voluntary. What more, mandatory human rights due diligence. And of course, this also is very much related to remedies when it comes to the concept of access to environmental justice and access for remedies. So these are the three takeaways. You also mentioned regarding the recommendation, is it?
Yep.
Did you answer also regarding the recommendation? Now, as far as recommendation is concerned, I think several recommendations are being highlighted throughout the 2 days event. One, clearly, in terms of there's a need of collaboration between ASEAN sectorial bodies when it comes to resolving issues related to environment and climate change, because AICHR alone as a regional human rights mechanism will not be able to take this particular issue alone, because there are other ASEAN sectorial bodies such as the ASEAN and the ASEAN Working Group on Climate Change. Number two is that we need a further more extensive commitment from the state, because we have identified there's quite a number of trajectory relating to the reports, declaration that has been signed relating to environment, climate change. But the main question remains as to how does this particular issue then is brought to the national level in terms of portraying the commitment of the state. Number three is that the concept of due diligence is still very new, but there's still a kind of willingness to adopt it, and this is very much very clear when it comes to certain level of larger companies, because of the regulators like the stock exchange impose that particular requirement, such as the ESG and so forth. But as far as mandatory due diligence, this is something still very new, still in discussion stage, although there are certain ASEAN member states that have actually adopted, like Singapore, for instance. That's one. In addition to that, there are also some other recommendations which includes relating to access to remedies, in other words, of providing suggestion to providing protection given to victims of violations of environmental harms in the region, and protection of human rights defenders as well, where the issue of SLAP was also discussed in great length. In addition to that, the fifth recommendation is relating to what is the best approach in resolving issues on cross-border. And of course, the only way is through the collaboration of the ASEAN member state in these matters, although this is still has called for some technical problems. But in other areas like plastic and marine litter, we have witnessed there are common approaches in which it has been achieved by the ASEAN member state. And finally, I have to say, when we're discussing about the proposed draft of the ASEAN Regional Framework on Environmental Rights, there are also some concern on, does it make a difference in terms of another framework? What would be the effectiveness of a new or additional framework? So the recommendation would be there should be further stakeholder engagement throughout the process, because in order to promote a better understanding and dissemination of knowledge among the relevant stakeholders, because if you were to compare to the other region like Aarhus Convention and Escazú Agreement in the Latin America, they take a long time actually in order to get that buy-in. So I think for this, the last recommendation is to ensure the buy-in from the relevant stakeholder and the state as well. And this can only be achieved by continuous stakeholder engagement at the regional level. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor AICHR. So I think she's mentioned about extraterritoriality, which I find it very interesting because it has been an ongoing issue, especially in the Southeast Asia level and concerning environment especially. And I think there's also this concern of how at the ASEAN level, when you have some commitments or standards in place, and how it trickles down, or how would at the national level government would want to implement that at the national level. So maybe just to continue on from this, I would like to invite Her Excellency Professor Amara to share what are some of the key takeaways from the regional dialogue.
Thank you, Uma. First of all, I'd like to say that AICHR has been working on, or have been organizing workshops and regional consultations on the issues of business and human rights since 2017. And we have done it every year together with UNDP and Bangkok Business and Human Rights Week. And so for this year, the title or the name of the workshop was AICHR Regional Dialogue, Sharing Good Practices on the Business and Human Rights in ASEAN. The main point is sharing good practices. And we organized the program to look at good practices carried out by the state, by business, and by labor. And this is something that we have learned from the past, that we need to expand our scope of work. In the past, we have been working with the states and business, the two sectors, and have not been working very much with labor. But this year, with the three good practices from the three sectors, we have been able to expand the scope. And by looking at all the three sectors, we achieved the goal of trying to work cross-sectoral and cross-pillar according to the ASEAN Community 2025 vision. So because in the past we have been working in silos, and human rights work in political security community, and the economic people just talk about trade negotiations. And social cultural community talk about vulnerable groups, women, children, etc. So this year, with the 3 sections, we have been able to integrate the 3. And so that's one achievement. The other one is that we learned the role of the states in introducing legislation and policy statements to fulfill the protection pillar of the UN guiding principles. The states are being, because of COVID also, they have learned to look at social safety nets. In some states have very weak social safety net programs. They learn that they need to expand that. So we have seen adjustment made by states. In terms of business, we learned that many business have initiate new program, and again, it's coping strategy because business had been very much affected because of COVID, and so they are making adjustment, and they learn very clearly that they need migrant workers to support the business. So business are making adjustment as well. And looking at the 3rd pillar, the labor issue, it's very clear that now we have to look at migrant workers more closely, and we need to expand our discussion on that. So AICHR, at least AICHR Thailand from now on, will work closely with the instrument called ASEAN Consensus on Migrant Workers. This is actually the issue of migrant workers. We had ASEAN Declaration on Migrant Workers since 2007, but we had not been able to achieve very far because of the different interests between the sending countries and receiving countries, and we have not been able to agree. And finally, they agree to disagree on certain issues and agree on some. So 2017, the migrant workers, the ASEAN Consensus on Migrant Workers have been adopted, but there are many weaknesses in there because they have to compromise, in trying to draft that. So we will have to, in terms of human rights, we have to work with the ASEAN Committee on Migrant Workers to support them on the issues of human rights. And in addition to that, we also feel also that we need to look at the implementation and monitoring aspect of human rights due diligence as well. We learned that there are CSOs who are tracking performance of business. These include, of course, Human Resource Center for Business and Human Rights and the World Benchmarking Alliance. These are CSOs with data, and before coming here, we also learned of other CSOs who have been tracking performance of business. We learned that there are research institutions who are monitoring the intersection between UN guiding principles and the ASEAN Consensus on the protection of migrant workers. And also international organizations such as IOM, who are providing us with tools for business to comply with the human rights due diligence requirement. So we learned there are a lot of things around us. And so we conclude that we must continue to monitor and evaluate performance of states and business in the implementation of the UN guiding principles, the human rights due diligence for sustainable development, and we will have to collaborate cross-sectoral, cross-pillar in the future to to move forward on business and human rights due diligence.
Thank you, Prof. Amara. So I think following on from this conversation with some of the key takeaways and recommendations that we've heard from these two events, I think I'd like to ask Prof. Amara first, how do you see the progress of ASEAN member states or AICHR as a whole in terms of mainstreaming business and human rights, especially on the implementation of the UNGPs? And also, how is the progress like in your country, Thailand?
We have to still work with our member states to agree to move forward. In ASEAN, there are 10 countries and will be 11 next in the near future. But some of us are more ready to move forward. So, the countries with transnational corporate firms will be more willing to move on. But the countries that do not have, the big business people are willing to move forward. So countries without big business tend to be slower. And so we will have to support each other. And I think we all agree in our meetings that we now have to not only involve big business, we have to involve small, medium-sized enterprises as well. So in the future, we have to work with supply chains. And this means that small corporate or small firms locating in most countries will need to be supported either by government subsidies, or the big firms will have to help subsidize small firms in order to support each other.
All right. Thank you, Prof. Amara. I think I have the same question also for Prof. AICHR, maybe to just give us an overview of what the progress is like in Malaysia when it comes to implementation of the UNGPs, and how are the businesses reacting towards this?
Okay, thank you, Uma. I have to say, as far as the progress of the UNGP implementation in Malaysia, there has some progress certainly, and it has advanced gradually throughout the years. Because initially it was actually started by the National Human Rights Institution back in 2013. And we can see many developments throughout the year that have been done by the NHRI on the promotion and advocacy program. There were extensive training programs to different stakeholders in Malaysia on the businesses and human rights, including not only the larger companies, but also regulators, government agencies, even I think CNF NHRIs, in which was invited. And then, if not mistaken, in 2015, there were initiatives on the strategic framework on the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, in which there is this particular document that was crafted that sort of incorporated 17 recommendations on business and human rights that can be adopted based on all the three pillars in UNGP by Malaysia at that time. And subsequently after that, there were initiatives to work on the National Action Plan, which started probably after 2017. And they formed then a secretariat, which is based in the legal division, Bahyu, in JPM. So we can see that as time progresses, in terms of implementation, and there seems to be some kind of normalization of standards when ESG index is incorporated by the regulators. So on that account, we can see there's more acceptance by the larger companies because the disclosure requirement for them actually requires them to do so. But for the smaller companies in which the financial reporting, companies reporting are still very much voluntary in terms of BHR activities such as the environment, labor practices, and good governance. So personally, I think in general, I think the progression has been gradually throughout the years, and we would like to see more advancement in this particular matter, having in mind the fact that now the work of National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights is very much work in progress. And we look forward in terms of the buy-in and participation of more companies within this particular approach, and especially in terms of the National Baseline Assessment Report. I believe that's going to be released very soon. So it has been a good progression, and I do hope that this will continue throughout the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. AICHR. So I think today I was reflecting on some of the questions that came up during the plenary session earlier. And one of it was how could these commitments be translated into actions? And could all these commitments be translated into actions? Like, can we? And also, I think by the chairperson of the working group on BHR said, like, you know, when it comes to standards and also commitments on human rights, it's not a buffet. You can't pick and choose. And it should be that companies have to take in whatever commitments and standards that are in place. And it's quite a tricky topic because when the question came up, we also had an encounter with businesses where they said, like, oh, which indicators or which standards should we follow? There's no standard set of commitments that, you know, we can tell them this is what you should follow, and it applies to all boards of companies or sectors. So I think my question next is for Dio. Looking at, you know, the commitments and standards that we have in place when it comes to business and human rights, what do you think of the performance of corporate actors in the region so far in addressing human rights issues?
Thank you so much, Uma, for the questions. And I think also thank you to Prof. Amara and Prof. AICHR for providing an outline and scene setting of the trajectory on the developments of businesses and human rights in the region. And I think before I answer the question related to the progress, I would like to take a few seconds perhaps to introduce to you. Perhaps not all of you in the room have known about the work that we do at the World Benchmarking Alliance. So we are a non-profit organizations, and what we do is that basically we are publishing freely available benchmark. Everything that we do is available online, and one of the benchmark that we develop is called social transformations, that look at the social transformations of businesses worldwide, and in terms of the angles in which there is labor indicators, there is human rights indicators, and there are also ethical act. And the number of companies, perhaps that just to scene set here, and that we are assessing worldwide, there are 2,000 companies. And in the region, in the Asia Pacific region, there are 63 region in ASEAN. And out of the 64 performances that I would like to outline below, has been so much, under developments when it comes to business and human rights perspectives. So the three main indicators that we look at in the social transformations benchmark is first, respect on human rights, that we look at the elements of human rights due diligence, we look at the elements of remedy, the commitment to human rights in general. And the second element that we look at on labor indicators are decent work. These are mainly looking at ILO, International Labour Organization indicators. And we assess the extent to which how companies provide healthy and safe workplaces. They adhere to living wage, diversity, and so on. And the ethical act that we assess is the extent to which these companies are abiding to data privacy commitments and anti-bribery commitments, anti-corruption, and responsible lobbying. So let me just dwell a little bit on the respect on human rights and human rights due diligence as we are discussing on the subject matter, especially on the rise of mandatory legislations worldwide on these aspects. So out of the 633 companies in ASEAN that we assess across different sectors, unfortunately, there is still a room for improvement, of course, on these companies. And therefore, there is a need to incentivize these companies through policies, through legislations at national and regional level to ensure that there's a healthy competitions for them to progress. And among these companies that we assess, the 63 companies, there are 11% of the 63 companies who are scored in the upper bracket, and no companies is actually in a very high-end scoring of these companies, of the trends. And there are actually 3 trends that I would like to share to the floor here, offline and online, is that when it comes to, as far as the human rights due diligence is concerned, we learned before from Prof. Amara and Prof. AICHR that human rights due diligence is still an emerging norms for businesses in ASEAN. And we need to get into that standards. And we need legislation to push the standards. The score on this aspect of among the 63 companies is low, with around more than 50 out of the 63, which is around over 80%, are scored 0 or not abiding yet to some extent, of course, on this human rights due diligence. So the elements of human rights due diligence, assessing, forecasting, actioning is not there yet. But there is a trend actually when we look at these companies, the grievance mechanisms, as far as they are disclosing in terms of the assessment, it's there. So usually when we look at the grievance, hopefully in the future, we look at how companies are actually already forecasting, understanding how impacted workforce, impacted communities are assessed before the business processes are being made. Now, this is more responsive, that the human rights, the current circumstances is more responsive among these companies, that human rights due diligence are not in place yet. That's the trend. But the grievance and mechanism among the companies are already installed. So this is actually the trend that we are now seeing in the region in terms of the 63 companies. And the second trend that we look at is that over than 50 out of the 60 companies do not have living wage standard, a fundamental disclosure in terms of how they are performing in terms of adherence to living wage. And the second of all, and probably this is noticeable to us all, is that the elements on respect to working hours. So we can say that workforce in ASEAN could potentially are overworked, and this is definitely something that we need to ensure that it is in place among the not only the 63 but all majority of the businesses in big businesses, but also it trickles down to the supply chains and smallholders and small businesses too. And the third trend that we saw on our benchmark is that over half, or around 40 companies, do not meet the recognized standard on data privacy and responsible tax and responsible lobbying, which in which that we need to ensure, of course, this is something that we need to consider in the region, that there is a policy in place that these big companies, when they operate, be it multinational, nationally or multinationally, extraterritorially, they are paying attention to these aspects. So I think that's all. I think I'll stop there. Otherwise, I'd steal too much of the time. And I hope looking forward to discussing with you on this as well. Thank you, Uma.
Thank you, Dio. So I actually have a follow-up question for Dio, and I think he mentioned something about impacted communities, which that also I have a question from Mbak Lukita here. So maybe Dio, you can just give me a brief sharing, because I think earlier there was a commonality between the sharings of the takeaways from the events by AICHR, which is where the standards are more accepted by larger companies. So my question is, what about SMEs where there is a concern of lack of resources and capacity? How do we include them in this conversation to comply to human rights standards and also human rights due diligence?
Shall I start?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think in my own perspective, when we look at SMEs in ASEAN region, the distributions and population of SMEs are different, of course, from one country to the other. Indonesia is one of the biggest country in the region, owns, I think, most of the SMEs population in the region. There are 65 million of SMEs. But we also have to understand the business scales of these SMEs, right? what we don't want is that, I think, of course, the principle to have human rights due diligence in place and respect of human rights is to ensure that there is no human rights violations or human rights standards being applied on businesses. However, we have to make sure as well, when it comes to SMEs, the spirit is there, but it does not jeopardize the human rights of SMEs as well. This is to ensure that we are not imposing a legislation that actually jeopardize them, that actually we are going against the principle, the nature principle of this SMEs. Plus, I think that's one of my key takeaway when it comes to SMEs is that we have to have a common understanding first in the region on the scales of businesses, on how they are, understanding what is actually human rights, right? What is actually child rights when it comes to SMEs? What is should they be part of the informal sector or formal sector, for instance? And we have to regulate this first, and before then we actually apply the standards. Otherwise, then we would encounter in a phase where these SMEs are actually creating. We are actually creating by imposing policy as the same standard as big businesses in the region.
Okay, thank you. So I think I just realized I have to speed up this whole question to all our panelists. So maybe I'll move on quickly to Mbak Lukita. I think she's an expert more on the child rights perspective. And my question for her is maybe you could share how businesses are committing to ensuring standards are adhered to, particularly where children are impacted, and what are some of the challenges that you encounter from your end as far as child rights are concerned in the region and also in Indonesia.
Okay, thank you, Uma. Good afternoon, everyone. This is a very interesting, and actually to answer to that question, we could not going to be complete in 2 hours discussion. So then I'll try to make a summary, or the one that is kind of most obvious one, UNICEF Indonesia has done this advocacy to the business sector, private sector, non-private sector, state-owned, and everyone is since 2012, where UNICEF, Save the Children, and UN Global Compact introduced the Child Rights and Business Principle. It's a 10-set principle covering how businesses is impacting children's rights in workplace, marketplace, and community and environment. So if Professor Aisa mentioned about climate change, children are affected. You talked about environmental degradation, then children will be the one who's going to inherit this earth. So then they're going to be affected. And then if you talk about products, services, and everything, then children is also affected. Even if the product is actually consumed by their parents, then the condition of their parents after consuming the products going to be affecting the child. So then the most challenge is actually to create an understanding of the context on how, if Dio was mentioning, what is child right for the MSME, for example, the micro, small, and medium enterprises. This MSME divide into two: the one who register their entities to the government, so that's part of the formal business sector, and the one who doesn't register, and that's mean those are the non-formal. Even the country or the state doesn't have data on where they are, who they are, what they do, what they put in as an ingredients to their products and everything. And that is a huge challenge for a country like Indonesia, because Indonesia is estimated to have 90% of the non-formal sector. So then even if UNICEF do the work with collaboration with other UN agencies, stakeholders, CSOs, and everyone, we only able to maybe reach numbers in terms of the formal sector, those big players. And for Indonesia, who also kind of like the #1 largest producer of palm oil, then it become a bit also dilemmatic situation, because those sector is contributing to the GDP, contributing to the economic of the countries. Even the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has published some article in 2018 saying it affected nearly 17 million people in the supply chains. And therefore, if something gone wrong with that supply chain, that means 17 million people going to be having a difficulty or disruption into their livelihood quality. And that also creates an uneasy approach in a way, because you really need to then understand what is critical for them. And the barrier that we learn is actually to translate the language that UN or any other human rights organization is used to be understood by the business as their language. Just like we try to approach the vulnerable group, like the people with disability, children, women, indigenous people, we try to translate to the language that they understand. Then we need to translate our language, this human rights language, to the language that business understand. What exactly children's rights mean for them? Why they need to pay attention to this future talent, the generation that going to take over the world, not only as their future employee, their future consumer, their future stakeholder, shareholder, business owner, or even government officials. So then the challenge again lies to that context. So then since 2014, the first time I learned about child rights and business, and back then I was on the business side, not the UNICEF side, I see that UNICEF and now still continues to try to provide that technical guidance, provide that evidence, provide and facilitate dialogue to various stakeholders, CSOs, business association, platform, networks, young people, adolescent, governments, to kind of like build where they have gaps, where which part or which term that we don't actually in agreement of. And even until today, we see that business only kind of like capture maybe small portion of it. Like if we say child rights to business and immediately they think child labor. No, we don't have child labor. We don't say you have child labor, because for UNICEF, children's rights is beyond child labor. It's the way how children is actually affected by the business, from the working parents, caregiver, and the rest. So then again, how we see or how I see on the progress of business respecting human rights in the region or in Indonesia, we see the answer may be in the enabling environment, because once business committed, once business buy in the ideas, they're not going to go to you, or they cannot go to UNICEF to then ask for help to help them develop a strategy or action. They need to go to service provider who understand and help them to develop and integrate that children's rights or any kind of special human rights into their strategy of business, into the KPI, key performance indicator, into the impact assessment, into whatever document strategy that their managers and the decision maker in the business going to be understand or going to learn, oh, this is where they are. And could that happen? Yes, they could, because we see some company do that. We see one company able to even put a sustainability index as a KPI index to the directors and the senior management level. We see that the one company create and develop a supplier code, so then it actually affecting run hundreds companies under their supply chains, to then confirm on how to understand children's rights impact and then create a mechanism of grievance, and as well as how to remediate if they found child labor or if they found a violation on child labor. And how do I know that? Because those consultants who is hired by those supplier is actually contacting UNICEF on asking, how actually we going to do this? Can you share me, or can you guide us or point who is the organization that can help us? So then the next homework in transforming commitment to action is to make a strong enabling environment that business is actually accepting. So those consultant firms, those service providers, training providers, business school, CSO who act as an advisor for business. So, and then researchers and also expert, a subject matter expert, that business is actually accepting their ideas and their commitment. And it's going to be quite a lot, because every business has a different impact to children, or maybe to women, or disability people, or indigenous. It's really depend on where they are operating, who they are, what they produce, and then what kind of raw material and others. So it cannot be a general and one size fit all. Maybe I'll stop there. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mbak Lukita. So I think the conversation on business and human rights, as you can see, is very multifaceted. It's also complicated, and there's so many issues that falls under this conversation. You have labor issues, you have environmental issues, you have governance issues, you can name it from A to Z. And then you have different stakeholders that are involved in this conversation. You have the vulnerable groups, persons with disabilities, youth, children, you name it. So like looking at the time, we are actually at 2:01. I think I got the time right, because the time difference between Bangkok and KL is an hour difference. So I don't know if this has changed. But before we move on to the Q&A session, I wanted to ask all our speakers here, what do you think needs to be prioritized to create an enabling environment for businesses to move towards sustainable and inclusive practices? So maybe I can go with Dio first. Or maybe Prof. AICHR, do you like to go first?
Oh, okay then. As far as business are concerned, I think they should actually put respecting human rights as one of the top agenda, escalating to top-down approach, because we know about company constitution and so forth, but they must walk the talk. That's very important, because now there are emerging standards and issues that companies need to perform. So that's particular one, commitment from businesses. We are aware, of course, larger corporations in most the ASEAN member state are very much subjected to the ESG component, so not to worry. But I think the concern would be the SMEs, which actually consists of, like in Malaysia, is 90% of the companies registered by the Companies Commission are SMEs. So I think that kind of commitment must be sustainable and must be worked upon. Number two is that the role of the state, the role of government to protect business and human rights must be continuous. And what does this mean? This should also include that the state should ensure that government sectors, agencies, and other state-based institutions that shape business practices are also aware and observe the state human rights obligations when fulfilling their respective mandate, because we are not just imposing standards and commitment to businesses, but also to the state and other government agencies that are linked with businesses. And what does that mean? This means including providing them with relevant information, training and support. And in order to achieve this particular objective, there must be a balance, because the state or the government needs to take a broad approaches to manage the business and human rights agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. AICHR. Dio, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thank you so much, Uma, for the question. I think since I'm holding a policy role, I would like to start with looking at it from the policy perspective first as well. I think it's quite important that we are creating an enabling environment, not only that is driven by businesses, but also from policy level, to ensure that the change that businesses are moving towards to are inclusive and they are sustainable. And why is this so? Because starting with policy, it can be a tool to incentivize businesses to basically level up their playing field on ESG, on sustainability standards, on human rights due diligence, even more than that, looking at the broader perspective as well, as the WBA looks at as how business are paying attention to their climate standards, their climate commitment, nature, biodiversity, urban development, and so on and so forth. So I think it can start at national or regional level, but we have to start by talking. I think there was a good point raised by Prof. Amara, then if I may, I would like to steal that, is that I think we need to start in ASEAN level also to continue the talk between pillars, so that everyone is not only working on focusing on economic purely economic issues, political security issues only, and socio-cultural. We are living in a globalized and interconnected world. And I think it's really important that we ensure the intersectionality of issues are being paid attention of, to ensure that these businesses are moving for the greater good, for a region that is inclusive, that is sustainable for all, and without leaving anyone behind. Thank you.
Thank you. Mbak Lukita?
Okay, so the question on priority is actually a specific skill to kind of like do that. So then maybe the priority, if I'm kind of like maybe could recommend to the state in their duty to protect, then the priority is more kind of like how they can actually enforce. Because it's not only about policy. Policy is there. Indonesia has laws, even laws that contradictive to one another. But then the question is then how to enforce it. Can state truly able to enforce, call the businesses who violate human rights to the court, for example? Will that be happening in ASEAN? I'm not sure. So then let's see, because it happenings for environmental area, such as on land fire, Indonesia do that. And for certain, but not the entire human rights in a way. So then the challenge is to prioritize to protect those who are not yet covered by any kind of social protection system. So those who are non-formal, and then how to enforce. And then for second one, on how the business could actually respect. So the priority is for sure, if you all kind of like Google on child rights and business, then the principal one says about statement disclosure. So then, yes, like Professor Aiza was saying, the first one is to disclose your commitment, either to, and if possible, to the public. So then the public could then make you accountable to what you're already saying, right? Then ask you to walk your talks. And then in that one principle, it's a simple principle, make a statement and then disclose it. But then it's required to understand, just like we respect our elders, we respect them because we know who they are our elders, they are our parents. So then the business has to understand who is human under these human rights that they are affecting, how it is affecting, and there is then creates an identified risk on how their operation or how their products and services is creating that risk. And they can try to develop the mitigation or to prevent or to then set a remediation accordingly. And then the rest of the public can then just try to also walk our talks, not only the businesses and the state. Like, for example, we as an individual is a consumer, right? And then the consumer has power. So then if we ourselves consider that this one company is creating a bad thing to the human or violating human rights, then don't buy it, don't use it. Because sometimes even us, we struggle between, but this is cheaper and that one is, that is costly. But that is actually what happened and what is experienced by businesses and by the state. They always face this dilemma. So then I forgot who's saying in the plenary, but don't point finger, but offer a constructive solution. Because at the end of the day, we don't want to create debate, but it doesn't go to anywhere. We want to use our precious time to find solution and try to figure out if we can agree to disagree, but what is cost on that disagreement? Is there causing another impact? Or if it does, then that disagreement has to come to one kind of the agreement so that it reduce the impact that it is created. Maybe that.
Thank you, Mbak Lukita. Prof. Amara, you're probably the last one, so.
I just be simple. And I think we still need to continue to raise awareness and build capacity on human rights due diligence. We still need to promote that and make the state responsible, state and business being responsible for their activities. So the human UN guiding principles and protect, respect, and remedy will have to be implemented. So that's my first point. Continue supporting the implementation of human rights due diligence, and after that we need to monitor the implementation and set up grievance mechanism or in case companies do not follow the human rights due diligence. But we need to work together and collaborate between the three sectoral bodies and pillars.
Thank you, Prof. Amar. So just a recap, I think there was the element of transparency and accountability, and there's capacity building, there's having the conversation between the three ASEAN pillars, and the commitment from businesses, among others. So I think maybe we can open up the floor to any questions. I was also informed that Her Excellency Yu Yun might not be able to deliver her closing remarks as her flight has been rescheduled. So we can allocate the remaining time to Q&A. So maybe if anyone has any questions, please raise up your hand and introduce yourself, and also just mention your name and organization. So we actually have a question online. Yes, so there's a question by an anonymous attendee. Would it be feasible to have an ASEAN level business network to enable peer learning and development of common processes? So, is ready? Okay, I think maybe someone can just answer for the person.
I think there are many alliance group where business people get together and try to help each other, starting with Global Compact Network, which started by early, because we had Global Compact, UN Global Compact since the year 2000, and we have business and human rights in 2011. So the first group would be the Global Compact Network, which is a big one, and now they form what they call Business and Human Rights Academy, trying to provide peer learning exercise, etc. And in the plenary session, we also learn of Responsible Business Alliance, where they want to, they organize, I think 400 members, something like that. So there are a network of business groups around. You have to find them.
Due to my nature of work, so UNICEF worked through business platforms, networks, and associations. So we do acknowledge one is Global Compact, of course, and then there is also many others, such as actually some kinds like the CSR Asia as well. And in Asia, under ASEAN, if I'm not mistaken, there is also a business council or business advisory council where businesses is also sometimes gathered to talk about what happened in the ASEAN region. Yeah, and then there are, among others, association and also platform and multi-stakeholders organization that is available. I do kind of like second Professor Amara. Maybe we need to proactive, like it's just a matter of Googling it now in the digital world, and then we can try to found. And yeah, maybe you could also try to reach out to ASEAN Commission to ask who are the platform or network that is already under their radar and their engagement platforms.
All right, thank you. We have another 2 more questions online. One of it is very long, but I'll just summarize it. To what extent do the proximity and interdependence between the state and business entities affect the implementation of the UNGP and the development of NEPs in ASEAN? That is the first question. The second one is, any specific stakeholders or industries in ASEAN that pose significant challenges and hinder the implementation of the UNGPs? So what are the reason for resistance, and what are the strategies that can be employed to address these challenges? To what extent do the proximity and interdependence between the state and business entities affect the implementation of UNGP and the development of NEPs?
For that question, I have to give the case of Thailand, where the National Action Plan, the NAP, had focused on 4 issues. And the last one, is working on cross-border investment, because they see that big business, Thai big business, when they go invest in other countries, may violate rights. And so they want to take care of this issue to save face for the country, really. So this is one of the 4, priority areas. So that's collaboration between state and business is there, especially in this case, the cross-border investment, because we don't want to be criticized for having bad business. The second question,
any specific stakeholders or industries in ASEAN that pose significant challenge to the implementation of the UNGPs and the development of NEP?
I will not mention names, but there are some companies who adopt the SLAP case, SLAP, strategic, legal, something. But big business, some business have been have had complaint on violating rights, and they want to prevent overt complaints, so they file the case to court. Human rights defenders have been sued or have been there are cases in court where big company accused human rights defenders of committing some crime. This is to prevent human rights defenders to help labor of those who have been violators. So this act of in the document, it's called SLAP, Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation, or something like that. So this kind of act should be prevented. And the Global Compact Network in our meeting last week said that they will try to tell their network members not to use SLAP, because that's also bad action. It should not be done.
Thank you, Prof. Amara. I think Prof. AICHR unmuted herself. So do you have anything to say?
Yes, thank you, Umar. I suppose responding to the last question, what are the specific challenges for companies in terms of UNGP? I believe in the context of Malaysia, maybe for business operation which are doing business in conflict affected areas. That is one very challenging, because at the same time the UNGP requires that the risk, there's gross human right risk is heightened in those areas, and it is expected for the companies as well to take a higher step. So this has posed, I think, quite a number of challenges, especially to certain sectors in Malaysia, where we know there's some multinational as well. So that is one of the challenges that actually at the moment is still existing. The other question that you mentioned is regarding the state business nexus in ASEAN. Apart from Global Compact, I do believe that within the ASEAN region, there is also that networking of regulators, like companies commissions of ASEAN, the Securities Commission, Stock Exchange, and so forth. Although these are regulators, but they do update from their membership members companies as well. So there are as well in terms of requirement or the regulators that impose upon companies which are registered on that. So there's already existing nexus there. I mean, I'm talking about my personal experience being part of a regulator before. There's already that ASEAN network. And I think the last issue that was raised, I think that was a question, is in terms of the resistance. Is it on a resistance for the National Action Plan? Maybe for some state. I have to say that when we started the process in Malaysia at that time, there is a matter of understanding and knowledge regarding what does commitment of NAP means, what it's all about. Does it mean that it requires a higher standard for companies, like complying with certain labor standards in addition to what is already there? So there was a concern at that time in which I think it will affect also in terms of the collection of data and buy-in. But I think throughout the years with the initiative done by various parties, I think that perception has sort of been reduced and mitigated. So I think initially there are certain concern about the need of compliance of certain standard to fulfill. So I think perhaps maybe those are my views on those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. AICHR. I think maybe do we have time for one more question? Oh, you wanna? Yeah, okay.
So just adding on the resistance. So from UNICEF Learning, one of the resistance during, if we found or hear during the FGDs or workshop or a dialogue, is that the business is quite confused on as I think this is also raised during the plenary, like which one did they have to follow? And then if you stand on their side, then they follow many reports that they have to prepare. So then there is this comment raised by the lady who are the internal compliance of the company, saying some things like, ma'am, do you know how much paperwork and the time schedule that I have to perform just because of different kind of thing? And so then they said that maybe it will ease their work and time if the state or whoever in the stakeholder group could actually interpret, like, for example, this is the international standard. The international standard require this. And then what exactly is aligned with the national law and regulation? Because in the business perspective, if they comply to the government law, they thought they safe. While according to the international and global communities, no, you're not safe because there is a gap. Your national laws say the threshold is A, while the international law or the international said that the threshold is B. So then there is this gap between the A and the B. And the businesses does not always understand that. So then what they want is that to have an integrated approach, to have a comparison analysis between standards and between principles. So then they know if they have to do the due diligence, is it has to be independent due diligence, or it can be integrated into an impact assessment or other kind of process. So then it will not be a duplicate investment. It will be in one go. And it's also sometimes imagine even for UN and these big companies receive us several times, sometimes from UNICEF, and then UN Environment came, and then UN Women came, and then UNDP came. So then for business, they're confused. What is that UN want? So then this is also my recommendation to the UN that we need to push on UN approach to analyze what exactly that we want with business, especially for those big ones with commitment, because they cannot actually understand those several requests, and they have also limitation despite they have a full of resources and everything. So then the resistance due to that, we need to showcase that it's possible and it's not as heavy as you think, but then someone has to kind of like fight the resistance due to that understanding that is misinterpreted, because so many standards and regulation and compliance that actually abiding them by the buyer, by the consumer, and by the government itself. So then, yeah, the resistance usually due to that.
Okay, thank you. We'll just allot a time for one more question. Oh, there is one from the floor. So I'm sorry, the online participant, because we've already answered 3 questions from you. But I mean, if we have time, we will respond to that. But is there a microphone there? The conference microphone, yeah. Please introduce yourself and then followed by your question.
Yes, hi. So my name is Half from UNDP. So thank you very much for the very informative session today, because how to say it, the title of the session is about mainstreaming business and human rights in ASEAN. So I just have a quick question, actually on two main points. Number one, because we are talking a lot about the awareness raising, about the commitment, about the guidance to the companies. And so I'm just wondering, number one, if ASEAN is as an intergovernmental organization, if you can provide a sort of guidance to company, let's say a guidance on HRDD to companies, and then later member states of ASEAN can adapt it to that country context, and then they can, member state can provide the guidance to their companies. So that's the number one. And number two, I also heard about the tri-sectoral collaboration between the public, private, and also civil society. So I'm just wondering if, again, ASEAN as an intergovernmental organization, if you can pull together 3 sectors. So maybe set up a sort of like dialogue between the 3 sectors, so we can bring them closer together. So again, I'm wondering if ASEAN can, is this a good idea, or is it like ASEAN can, if I think that ASEAN have the mandate to do it, but I'm just wondering, like, if AICHR, maybe is it a question for Professor AICHR, if AICHR can, if AICHR think it's a good idea, or is there, or if they can be in the position to pull together the 3 sectors. So over.
Yes, the second question. AICHR had mandate to work with civil society, to work with all stakeholders. So we are trying to in our working group on ASEAN environmental rights, we have space to bring those people separately at a time or together. Yes, and that's part of our plan as well. That's the second question. The first question, we will have to follow international standard. There is no need for ASEAN to set up a separate set of standard to tell the member states to follow. We use the international standard. But for ASEAN, if we were to do it like the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, it's not as good as the international standard, because it will be less lower than the international standard.
Yes. I would like to come in on this point. I don't mean that we set a new standard for ASEAN, but on HRDD, human rights due diligence, because many companies, because I understand that right now there are a lot of like guidance for company, even from Responsible Business Alliance, like they also have, their own guideline for their member. But I'm just wondering, like, if there's, for example, Japan, just last year, they released a guideline for responsible supply chain. So I'm just wondering, ASEAN as an intergovernmental organization, you can do a guidance, not the standard. not creating a new standard, but just a guidance for companies in ASEAN, because of course the context in ASEAN also different from other regions and also different from other countries, let's say like Japan. So I'm just wondering, because we are talking about, you know, a holistic approach, a regional approach to mainstream business and human rights in ASEAN. So maybe ASEAN can consider this point, but of course I might be wrong. So that's why I'm just like
we can do it, but there's no plan at the moment. So we'll take that into consideration. Thank you.
I think Prof. AICHR probably wants to say something.
Yes, I think the idea is very noble, I have to say, when you talk about normalization of standards, because there's a working committee that works on the different standards among the ASEAN member states, and it actually encroaches within all the 3 pillars. So if this task, it's quite difficult to be undertaken by AICHR alone, because it touches on the core of all 3 pillars for this working committee. But as far as like due diligence or the universal concepts like UNGP, at the moment, AICHR, being a body that has been working very closely on business and human rights, certainly can actually adopt these good practices by way of advocacy programs and activity through their ASEAN member state, because that's actually a common standard involved with that. So I think we need to be careful in terms of criteria. What kind of standards are you targeting upon? Because there are different standards already worked by different bodies. But if it's more on business human right, the fact that there are already existing universal standard imposed by UNGP, which is the most authoritative document on business and human right, I think that is workable on that account. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Prof. AICHR. So I think we're already running behind time, so we'll have to wrap up. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this session. I actually wanted to share something on SLAP, which is Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. And I actually brought a book, which I co-authored. It's actually a practitioner's guide kit for SMEs on human rights compliance regarding environment and labor, and I co-wrote the chapter on SLAPs and external grievance mechanism. So I actually have 5 copies that I brought with me. If anyone wants, just let me know and I'll be happy to share it with you. And we also have it in soft copy as well, but I forgot to put it in a QR code. But anyway, thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a good day.